Hello again. Welcome to lecture 3 of the Programming for Powerlifting series that I'm doing for onlinestrengthcoach.com. Today's topic is putting together an overreach on our overload block. During this lecture, we will go through the theory that underpins training on a wider sense, but also more how that relates to what we call overreach or overload. Then we'll go into the specifics of how you create it within weight training or within powerlifting specifically. We'll go over 3 well-known programs that use overload in their design or use overreach in their design. We'll go through some more of the specifics, and then we'll look at a real-life overload block that's been put together for one of my online clients. Okay, so we'll begin. I'll just disappear so you can see the slides. Okay, first of all, what is overreaching? And before we can understand what we're trying to achieve within the context of powerlifting or within the context of lifting, there are 3 key theories that underpin pretty much all of periodization and programming. And only if we have a general understanding can we really understand what we're trying to achieve, and only with a more in-depth both practical, theoretical understanding of it can we really put together training cycles that not only achieve the goal of overreach, but also have correct duration, correct volumes, correct intensities, achieve an overreached or an overtrained, or to achieve an overreached state and not an overtrained state. And we'll go through some of that later on, what the difference between those two are. I'll probably skip back one, sorry. So the 3 theories we're going to go over. First one's general adaptation syndrome, second one's overcompensation theory, and the third one's fitness fatigue theory. So firstly, general adaptation syndrome. This was proposed in 1936 by a zoologist by the name of Hans Seal. It's a very simple concept. Basically, when a body goes into a stress situation, when there's exercise stress, disease, this was initially proposed for disease. We go into what's known as the alarm stage. Basically, the stress takes the body out of homeostasis. So homeostasis is a state of equilibrium. It's when everything's the same. And that's what your body wants to be. Your body wants to be in a state of equilibrium. In an exercise context, we puncture that equilibrium with an exercise stressor, and that's what causes the alarm stage physiologically. Next, we go into the resistance stage, which is basically when the body fights back and adjusts. So, in the context of a disease or an infection, this is when your immune system kicks in. So, the alarm stage might be when you first get sick, you get runny nose, you get dizzy, whatever the symptoms are. Later down the track, maybe with a viral infection, when your temperature rises and your immune system kicks in and your white blood cells are actually fighting the infection, this is the resistance stage. Within an exercise context, so for example within powerlifting, after we do, say, a squat session, our resistance stage is when satellite cells start attaching to damaged muscle fibers, and we start to recover. Our protein synthesis levels are raised, and we start to build new muscle mass. We start to inhibit things like Golgi tendon responses, muscle spindle responses. There's a whole, it's like neurological response, central response, where we get better intra and intramuscular coordination, better rate coding, things that lead to adaptations that lead to better coordination within the lift. And we get other adaptations that lead to morphologically larger muscles, and adaptations that allow us to recruit higher threshold motor units quicker. So within the strength training context, there's a whole bunch of different adaptations or responses to the exercise stressor of lifting within this resistance stage. And then finally you have the exhaustion stage. So this is basically when the resistance stage has went on for too long. the subject or the person hasn't allowed for adequate rest, or they've not allowed for, in the case of disease, the resistance stage has not been successful, and either they get more sick and die, or within terms of adaptation, or within terms of adaptation to exercise, insufficient rest in an exhaustion stage, basically what leads to overtraining, overuse injury, a lack of fitness from training. So we prevent exhaustion stage with sufficient rest. So that's the general adaptation syndrome in a kind of a gross context. Next we have supercompensation theory. So again, this was proposed by Nikolai Yakovlev, so apologies for my butchery of that pronunciation, in 1949, and basically through the 10 years following on, so from 1949 to 1959, he developed this theory. This theory is pretty much what underpinned a lot of the Soviet training principles and a lot of their track and field, weightlifting, general sports, the periodization that they brought into sports, and especially Olympic sports. This is pretty much the major theory that underpinned it. So basically what we have here is a one-factor theory. So we have fitness level. So fitness level is this purple line. What we do is we induce our stress, or we reduce our stimulus, as it's more commonly known, although I think stress is a much more appropriate term. Our fitness drops. With sufficient recovery, our fitness returns to a baseline, and then over time we get a supercompensation, or our body overcompensates for that fitness. So if it's an aerobic stressor, then with training and then with recovery, this supercompensation comes from central cardiovascular adaptation, so within the heart, larger stroke volume, within the lungs, larger lung capacity, peripheral, larger capillary density. Within a strength training concept, a lot of what we went through beforehand, like larger muscles, better coordination, better ability to recruit high threshold motor units to produce force quickly, or to produce more force. This is the supercompensation that we get. So if you only train once a week for squat, say, we produce the training stimulus, say after 4 or 5 days, we recover, and then maybe 4 to 8 days, we reach a super compensated peak, or we reach a fitness level that's higher than before, but without training, this will fall back down to baseline and eventually detrain. So that's within a general concept. That's how training works. We have X fitness. We supply Y stimulus or stress, and then over time we get Z outcome. And with too much time we detrain, with sufficient time we hit a higher level of fitness. Okay, so the more modern theory, or probably the more current theory that we utilize within programming, is called fitness fatigue. It's the fitness fatigue model, proposed in 1982 by Bannister. This two-factor theory recognizes the effect of fatigue on fitness. So basically it's very similar to supercompensation, but it's a two-factor theory. So the two factors are your fitness level and your fatigue level. So what we see here, we see training being applied, which means we have an increased level of fatigue. Our performance kind of mirrors our fatigue level, although our fitness may be higher. So we apply the training stress, fatigue's high, fatigue dissipates, and we see here, round about here, our performance peaks, when in fact our fitness is actually on a downward trend. So this can be applied cyclically within a programming context. Markers of fatigue we might be able to use within training. We can use things like heart rate variability. We can use neural measures like squat jumps, depth jumps, If you have something like a gym aware or a push band, you can maybe monitor it using something like a squat jump test to monitor the athlete's preparedness for the session. These are things you can kind of put in reactively to measure the effects that the training is having on your level of fatigue. Within a training context, what we do is we look at the volume and the intensity and the payoff between the two. So what we can infer within the gross level is when volume load is high, then fatigue is going to be high, which necessitates that the week after, 2 weeks after, fitness, although fitness may be improving, performance is going to be down. So, for example, when you go through, as we'll discuss later, when you go through an accumulation block, such as the first 3 weeks of the Russian squat routine, your fitness may be at an all-time high in a squatting context, which means you may be stronger than you've ever been before within a squatting context. But fatigue is so high that if you were to go and try a max, maybe 2 days or 3 days afterwards, you'd probably find that your results would be the same, if not worse, than when you started, because the fatigue that you've accumulated is masking your actual fitness or your actual performance. So that's the two-factor theory of training, the fitness fatigue model. So hopefully now you've got a bit more of an understanding between the three kind of core adaptation theories that we utilize within sports science, going from the oldest to the newest, and how that's incorporated by the training principles that are utilized within most programming. So here we have the basics of training, 4 key training principles. So these are 4 principles that all sports programming should adhere to. First one, specificity. The training that we are putting ourselves under have to match closely the demands of the sport or the competition. So within powerlifting, as I discussed with, or Nick discussed with me slightly earlier, the training should be geared towards improving 1RM performance. It's not about inducing higher 10 RMs, 8 RMs, 12 RMs, or getting good at doing rep outs in the gym. It's about increasing your 1 rep max. So that means within a lifting context, we shouldn't be looking to utilize technique or form that isn't representative of a maximum effort, because we're not training the qualities that we want to. We're not training the movement that we want to utilize under a maximum lift. One of the many reasons why you shouldn't let your technique break down in training, because when your technique breaks down, you're training incorrect movement, you're training inefficient movement. We're not adhering to specificity of training, which is probably the number one most important training principle in any program for any sport. The second one we should look at is overload. So basically, we need to produce a higher or novel stress to the body to produce adaptation. So whether it's fitness training, you have to get out of breath, you have to take your heart rate up, you have to take yourself out of your comfort zone, as it was. And within strength training, it's quite similar as well. We need to take the body past volumes it's handled before. We need to handle loads for reps it hasn't handled before. We need to, at some stage, look to set PBs acutely or more longitudinally. We need to accumulate more fatigue than we have by doing more volume than we ever have done before. We need to maybe look at handling with increased frequency, more volume across the week, or a higher average intensity throughout the week. There's a whole load of ways of doing it within powerlifting, but the key principle here is we need to produce novel or new stresses to the body that mean that we're going to adapt. So when we look at the GAS principle, the general adaptation syndrome, we need to produce a stress that is of a level that the body has to produce a response, it has to adapt towards it. So that's within supercompensation theory. When we apply a stress of a certain magnitude, the body overcompensates, because next time it encounters that stress, it wants to be ready for the stress. That's how it's evolved as a biological system. It adapts to stress so that the next time it comes in contact with that same scenario, it's better prepared to handle it. So we need to keep producing scenarios or keep producing stresses that are of a higher level than it's used to. So it continually goes down that adaptation route. Next thing is progression. This is a very important principle that a lot of powerlifting programs, a lot of strength programs, even more so a lot of sports programs kind of forget about. And this stuff's from GCSE physical education within the UK, so it's not high level intellectual property. Just took it off the BBC Bite-Size website. So progression, start slowly and gradually increase the amount of exercise and keep overloading. Very, very simple, very key when we start any kind of training program. So we're starting a 12-week training phase, 24-week training phase. Always undercook yourself. Give yourself room to kind of get into the habit of the training, into the groove of the training. So for instance, if we start a new program that has a frequency of 3 times a week, there's no need to go straight into what I might term as a meaningful percentage. So what I've termed as a meaningful percentage is 80 to 100%. This of RM strength is basically what acutely will typically induce a stress response. Those kind of RMs with sufficient intensities. There's no need to start there. You can start 50%. Strength training is a long process. Adaptation is a long process. There's no need to kind of go ham straight away. Start light and build into it. And then eventually reversibility. Any adaptation that takes place as a result of training can be reversed. Will be reversed when you stop training. If you take a break or don't train often enough, you will lose fitness. Simple enough. So if you take an off-season period or you take a holiday, if you go away on holiday for 4 weeks and don't lift any barbells, you're going to take a backward step. That's fine. In some instances, this can be desirable, and in other instances, it's completely undesirable. It just depends on where you're at in your training plan, what you have coming up, etc. That's more applicable to the annual plan. So producing a sustained ability to overload in powerlifting, this is kind of key. To be able to keep progressing in powerlifting, we need to produce sufficient stress applied intelligently over time to allow the lifter to keep their progression prolonged and sustained. We can manipulate the following variables to achieve this aim. We can mess with the frequency, we can have higher frequencies, we can have lower frequencies, intensity can be modulated, we can train at higher intensities, lower intensities, volume as well can be manipulated, periods of high volume, periods of low volume, and we can of course change the type or the variation of what we're lifting. So we can introduce things like in a squat, front squats, pause squats, box squats, cambered bar squats. These are the 4 kind of variables that we can manipulate and change within a programming context to get out the fitness gain that we're after. Typically, I would say you're better off to manipulate one variable within a week or within a period of time. So, say for example, within a 3-week block or a 4-week block, I might set frequency. I would normally set frequency at a level, so say a frequency of 3. Intensity and volume, they will change week to week. One will take the onus, the other will take the onus. So in one week, as we'll see later when we get on to the actual case study, intensity is higher, volume is lower relative to each other, and those two flip-flop from week to week. It's another way of kind of providing variation without changing exercise modalities too much. Another way we can induce adaptation, and probably more from a coordination standpoint or from a skill standpoint, is introducing variations and types of movements that are going to help the lifters kind of unlock some problems within their own movement. That's something we covered more in the previous lecture on technique and volume blocks, that you can watch that and get more information on it. With enough adaptation time, or for a larger gain of fitness, sometimes we require an overreach stimulus. Cumulus as it is there. Apologies for my spelling. If you follow my blog or any of my content, you realize my spelling is atrocious and I need to get hire an editor. Okay, what is an overreach and how does it work? So through the systematic overloading of one or more of the key training variables that we just discussed, we put the body under a period of sustained and high stress, where we don't allow for sufficient recuperation time, sufficient recovery time for it to dissipate the stress and to adapt. We basically keep hammering at it for a period of time, so we're actually decreasing our performance intentionally through increased stress. So like 3 or 4 weeks of systematically increasing volume, or systematically trying to lift heavy, or systematically changing the movement and going for maximum effort of repetition or maximum effort of weight on the bar, such as within West Side. And this leads to a long period of decreased performance and increased feelings of soreness and being overtrained. So lifters, generally their appetite will raise for a while and eventually it will decrease. They'll feel tired more often, they'll need more sleep, they'll probably go towards more recovery methods such as like massage or foam rolling, ice baths maybe in some instances. They'll kind of go towards those bolus or those placebo effects because they'll be feeling beat up all the time, but they're meant to be feeling beat up all the time. It's actually the goal of the training block if we're overreaching. And when we allow for sufficient tapering or rest, the results that we get out of an overreach period of training or a prolonged overload period is a large increase in specific fitness. So when we go through one of the two squat overreach programs that we're going to look at, Smolov or Russian squat routine, as long as the stimulus or the stress is appropriate, what we get out of that block is a large increase in our strength, our squat strength, our specific fitness, which is squat strength. This principle is known as overreaching, and it has its roots initially in supercompensation theory. One of the books I would recommend anyone check out would be Science and Practice of Strength Training by Zadarsky, and the new versions with Bill Kramer, co-edited with Bill Kramer. If you can't get your hands on the original version, it's kind of like in a green book, smaller hardback copy. Check that out. It's a bit more old school, but I think it's a bit better because it's a bit more old school because it brings different ideas, slightly different skew on sports science than the current one. The new one's kind of infiltrated more with modern, kind of Americanized sports science. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's something you can get from any textbook, like the NSCA textbook or Mike Stone's textbook. This will give you a little bit more of a different skew. I think it's a good skew to have and a good skew to be exposed to. But basically within there, there's a whole bunch of stuff on overreach, and if you're more interested in reading on it, that's probably the book I would start with. Okay, so walking the fine line. So what we have here, we have a basic supercompensation model. We're not looking at fitness fatigue here. We just have one factor. So we're not looking at what's happening to fatigue here. We're simply looking at specific fitness, or performance as it's termed. So here's the start of the block. Here's the overload or the overreach stimulus. With enough time and recovery, we reach a peak, or we have a supercompensation, and then with enough time we detrain to what our new baseline is. And with enough time, that detraining will go below the original baseline. Here we have the fine line between being overreached and overtrained. Basically, we do the same kind of overload period or the overload block, but we push it a little bit too long. For instance, maybe we push it for, instead of running Smolov base cycle for a 3-week period and then getting our adaptation out of it, we run Smolov base cycle 3 times in a row. 1, 2, 3. Fuck, I'm sore. I've got knee problems. I've got back problems. Can't sleep too well. My appetite's gone. I feel like shit. Sweat a lot. My rest and heart rate's increased. Basically, we've pushed too far. And if we don't get some kind of overuse injury, or like an acute injury, we enter in an overtrained state. Now, an overtrained state is not an indefinite state. It could last for 4 weeks. It could last for 8 weeks. It's kind of depends on the amount of time that you spend in the red. So if you go for if you push for hard for 12 weeks, push for too hard for 16 weeks, you're gonna take longer to come out the other end and come back to where you were than if you spent 4 weeks or maybe spent a week or 2 weeks too long on the program. This is quite a fine sort of line. That's why I call it the fine line. It's a delicate balance. It's something that requires a fair bit of experience and a fair bit of training experience and knowledge to walk with athletes. And this is kind of this is probably the primary reason actually that people get hurt in the gym, is that they apply overload for too long. They don't allow for enough time for tissue recovery. They don't have enough time for adaptation, recuperation, and eventually they end up with a joint, a ligament, or a muscle goes into spasm. Best case scenario is muscle spasm, but we can get things like stress fractures in some extreme instances, torn rotator cuffs, labrum tears. These sort of things are totally avoidable within strength training. We just needed to know how to program and when to pull back. That's the biggest problem, is most people don't know when to pull back, or the vast majority of people never pull back. They just keep going until it's too late. Okay, so 3 common examples of overreach or overload blocks. I think we've probably got a reasonable understanding or a reasonable grasp now of the kind of gross physiology behind it, without going into any major detail. So the 3 programs we're going to go over. We're going to go over this Russian squat routine. We're going to go over the Smolov base cycle. I was going to go over the whole Smolov cycle, but the switching cycle is so unstructured that I thought I would leave it because it's too much of a grey area. And then we're going to look at like Mike Stone's concentrated load block that you might not be familiar with if you haven't done a lot of sports science. Okay, so let's have a look. I'll pop up again. Hello. Okay, so this is the Russian squat routine. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with it. Don't know how to get rid of this. Okay. So here we have the sessions. There's 3 sessions in a week, so that's week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6-week program. Okay, so the overreach or the overload comes from the first 9 sessions or the first 8 sessions. So what this is an example of, this is an example of an accumulation block or an accumulation phase. And what we're accumulating is we're accumulating fatigue. We're basically taking 80%. And the reason that this is being shown, the reason that 80% has been chosen for this block is that based off weightlifter training journals, or the training journals of weightlifters from the 70s and 80s, Russian sports scientists determined that 80% was the optimal training percentage for the back squat. They determined that higher volumes with moderate percentages was the most efficient way, or seemed to be the most efficient way of increasing strength, specifically within the back squat. And you'll see weightlifters train with much higher percentages with the competition lifts, and there's many reasons for that we won't bother going into. Okay, so volume load, basically, this is an arbitrary measure that I've chucked together. So normally volume load is the weight you lift times the reps that you've lifted. So for example, for this session, we have 12 lifts in the session. If the load is 100 kgs, your volume load would be 1.2 tons or 1,200 kilograms. What I've done is I've just taken the intensity by percentage and times it by the total reps. So it gives us a measure. It's pretty much the same measure, but with a different unit. So as you'll see, 6 sets of 2 is like the core session. That's what we alternate with. So that's our first session, but it's also every alternate session. So we'll go 6 sets of 2, then 6 sets of 3, 6 sets of 2, 6 sets of 4, 6 sets of 2, 6 sets of 5, 6 sets of 2, 6 sets of 6, typo. Now this 6 sets of 6, this is if you choose the correct weight, this is one hell of a workout. You'll find the success of 5 very difficult. You'll probably find the success of 4 reasonably difficult. This is torturous. This is a torturous workout, and if you get it right, you'll make it on the nose. You'll be surprised probably by set 3 how you're still going, but you'll still be able to go and still be able to make your reps and your sets. So this is basically the end of the accumulation block. By the end of this workout, you're going to be fucked. But this is where this part of the program here, this is the overreach or the overload part of the program. This is what we're talking about here. So this is when we're using accumulation of volume, load, to induce enough fatigue or to induce enough stress for a prolonged period of time that we are putting the body in you're going to be stiff, sore, all the rest of it, because you're going to be in overreach state. Then what we do is we take the exact same amount of time to gradually reduce the training volume. So we're going to enter more of a peak. So here you'll see the back end of the program: 6x2, 5x5, 6x2, 4x4, 6x2, 3x3, 6x2, 2x2, 6x2, 1x1. So for example, to show the amount of volume drop off, in this first workout we lose, I think it's 11 reps, go from 36 to 25. So we use 11 reps, or lose 11 reps, or we lose 30% total volume in that session. And then we lose a similar amount, 20 to 30%, 20 to 30%, 20 to 30%, 50%. There's a fairly large melting away of the volume load because we're dissipating fatigue. And we're also starting to ramp up or hit a peak. So we're starting to take this overload stress, or take this overreach that's going to be primarily, a fair amount of it is going to be neurological adaptation, efficiency with the technique, because 80% is heavy enough that the technique that you utilize with that weight is probably going to carry through to 100% plus. But it's also with more morphological, hypertrophy, the sort of adaptations that we're going to get. And this back end here, this is a peaking phase. So here we have, like we said before, a melting away of volume and then an increase in intensity so that we hit here. So this is, by the time this workout hits, we should have hit our peak overcompensation, or our fatigue should be dissipated enough that we feel good. And then the minimum you should normally expect out of this program is about a 5% jump in your 1 rep max. This is the volume load and the intensity. So you'll see intensity remains flat like we discussed. Here's the peak in volume, the peak in fatigue, and then you'll see the volume kind of over time melts away and the intensity over time comes up. So here is where we're going to hit our peak fitness. So here is the overload or the overreach, and here is the recovery phase or the peaking phase, and here's the peak. Okay, so that's the squat routine, an example of an accumulation cycle, of accumulation of volume. And Smolov base cycle is another accumulation cycle. So it's 4 weeks. 4 weeks. So here's week 1, week 2, week 3. First session is 4x9 is 70%, 5x7 is 75%, 7x5 at 80%, and then 10x3 at 85%. If we look at these volume load factors, so like 28 within the first week, the overload here is 28.8. So you can already see that this is a much more aggressive training program, much more aggressive. So what I've done here is the original program recommends that you jump up 30 pounds or 15 kilos in the first. It recommends you jump up 20 pounds in the first in the second week. So you put your 1 RM in. These are the percentages you train at. Week 2, you're recommended to put it up 20 pounds. So that's 10 kilos. And week 3, you're recommended to jump it up an additional 10 pounds. So that's 30 pounds in total from the original weight, or 5 kg. So it's a 15 kg or a 30-pound increase from week 1 to 3. What I've done is to kind of account for this, I've put a 5% increase on week 2 and a 2.5% increase on week 3 to kind of mirror that increase in a slightly more precise way, or a way that I could quantify easier in this context. So if we look at week 2, it's basically the exact same cycle with more weight, and week 3 is the exact same cycle with more weight. This is what I would term maybe a more of a systemic fatigue accumulation cycle, to give it a stupid name. Basically, this is basically just 3 weeks of overload. So week 1's overload, week 2's overload, and week 3's even more overload. We're basically really going hell for leather on this one. This is the kind of training cycle that if you run more than 2 or 3 times concurrently, I almost guarantee you're going to get injured. This kind of accumulation cycle here, it starts low and finishes high, but this week's not too bad. This is a reasonable training week. It's not a crazy difficult training week. So if you were to run this concurrently, by the time you hit 6 by 6 and then come back and start this training cycle, you're going to get a bit of fatigue dissipation here, so you can kind of run up the ladder again. This is a program you can probably run concurrently for a fair bit. If you start with a light max, this is a program you can probably run concurrently for 6 months, 12 months even, depending on what your training tolerances are like, and what your injury history is like, and how strong you are. This is one I can almost guarantee you're not going to be able to run for more than 5 blocks. 5 blocks would be like superhuman. Most people would probably get injured after about block 2 or 3. Here we have the intensity and the volume load. So you'll see it's basically just a linear increase, down, linear increase, down, linear increase, down. Volume load does the exact same thing. There's no real appreciable drop within volume load. Here is where our volume load starts. Here is where it finishes. So we're not starting high and finishing low in like a cyclical or a wavy pattern. We're basically just going straight up. This is like a left to right diagonal line, and is more of a shock training block, or what we said beforehand, it's more of a systemic accumulation of fatigue rather than like a typical accumulation block where we start lower and over time accumulate fatigue over the block. We're basically accumulating a significant amount of fatigue from week 1, and then we're upping it, and then we're upping it. Okay, and then finally what we have here is Mike Stone's concentrated load. So Mike Stone tends to operate using block training. So he has like a work capacity or a hypertrophy block. Typically consists of sets of 10, and then he has like a strength block, which typically consists of 3 sets of 5. He utilizes a relative intensity method, so it's not an actual percentage. It's a very heavy, so a very heavy is anywhere from 95 to 105% of your 1RM, and like a heavy, which is anywhere from 90 to 95%. And then we have moderately heavy and moderate example. It's Mike's way of doing it. I've seen people utilize it with reasonable success. It's not my favorite training method, but I think it's quite a neat little program to show how this might be done, utilizing 1 training session a week. So the concentrated load here we have is 5 sets of 5, set at 82.5%. Then we go down to 3 sets of 5, 75%, 3 by 5, 80%, and then 3 by 5 at 85%. So the idea is that this would have been a very difficult set of 5 at the start of the block, but because we're doing 5 sets of 5 at what should be a quite hard, so something like an 8 to 9 RPE, whereas this might be like a 9 to 10 RPE. If we do 5 sets of 5 at an 8 to 9 RPE, we're gonna increase cortisol. We're gonna induce a stress response. We're basically gonna go into a bit of an overreach state. Although, because we only induce it with 1 or 2 workouts or a week's worth of training, we're going to recover typically within about 3 weeks. Where this concentrated load program comes from, and why it's quite a nice example of a program that's based within physiology, was Mike did this with the American weightlifting men's team. I don't know if they use women as well at the Olympic Training Center in Florida. And basically what he did was he produced them concentrated, what he called a concentrated load, which is basically an overload block or an overreach block. He then measured with saliva and blood cortisol and serum testosterone, and he basically found that typically about 3 weeks post, serum testosterone peaked and cortisol kind of dipped. So what we can infer from this is within an overreach within a weight training population or an elite weight training population, typically the bounce is going to be about 3 weeks out. So if you are running a 4-week training block, if you want to maybe use a front-loaded block, so if, for example, maybe something like Boris Shiko kind of routine, if you wanted to produce something like 60% of your volume in week 1 and then have kind of 2 lower blocks and then have the third block kind of higher volume but also higher intensity, you probably get a bounce response from that. And this is something that I've utilized quite very successfully with my own training kind of a good few years ago now, but from first hand, this kind of method definitely works. And it's just a nice example of where someone's taken good. Mike's very smart. Mike's methodology would have been great. So it would have took good methodology within a very specific, highly trained population, and then turned it into a training cycle or an applicable training cycle that we can utilize, or certainly a general principle or a general block we can utilize. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation. Okay, now we've seen three programs from the wild, or 3 popular overreach programs that you probably have heard before. At least 2 you definitely would have heard before. Let's talk about planning an overreach block. So the block prior should definitely have a volume or a technique focus. There's no point, for example, coming off the back of a meet where you peaked out and your fitness is at the lowest ebb it's going to be during the training year, or the actual training year, or off the back of an off season where we've had 3 or 4 weeks break, or instead of a general preparation phase. It's we should have performed a high level of specific fitness work. So in the terms of powerlifting, what we discussed before, a period of high volume with the lifts themselves. The overreach shouldn't really be a one-trick pony. So something like Smolov is not a terribly well designed overreach block for a sustained amount of time. Because it's a one-trick pony, it has the one week mesocycle, and then what you do in the mesocycle is you just increase the weight. Yes, it will work. Yes, it will provide an overreach. Yes, if you follow the Smolov cycle the first time you do it, you're probably going to get a pretty good, if not really good, gain in your specific fitness or your strength. But it's too much of a one-week pony. It's something that's going to stall out more than likely. The best way, in my opinion, to achieve an overreach is through accumulation of volume. You can utilize an overload of intensity. I would use one or the other. We need intentional overwork. And we need to also utilize acute fatigue. So as many reps as possible sets and pyramid sets are great for this sort of work. What you'll see when we go to the case study now is you won't see pyramids. I've used them kind of previously with this athlete in prep blocks, but for this specific overreach block, we're inducing specific fatigue through a mixture of overload of intensity and AMRAPs, and then in the middle weeks we're just accumulating a bit of volume. They're more of a down week, but they're still like a training stimulus. Okay, so putting together an overreach block, typically 4 to 6 weeks in length, I would suggest. I would flip between an acute fatigue inducing method and a holding week. Aim of the block is to come out overworked or feeling fucked. You should look to set personal best during the block. So during your acute fatigue inducing sessions, they should be at personal best levels. We should be doing things with sets that we haven't done before. Now let's have a look at an example of an overload block. Okay, so I've not got the lifter's name in it for reasons of privacy. So if we have a look here, this is the prep block that they went through previously. So you'll see we have total lifts here, relative intensity, and we'll see, although it undulates, we're talking about a linear block in reality. So total lifts basically go down over time, and intensity goes up over time. As you'll see, it's a very much a powerlifting program. So session 1, squat, close grip bench press, deficit deadlift. Session 2, pause deadlift to the knee, pause bench press, box squat above parallel. Session 3, squat against bands, slingshot bench press, deadlift. And then, because it's more of a prep phase, session 4 is just a bodybuilding assistance session, just looking to add mass overall in the upper body. So here's the overreach block. Okay, so see here, the last block was, if we just go back here, last block was 5 weeks in length. This block is 4 weeks in length. You see here we have an overload block, holding our intensity focus block, overload, and then holding our intensity focus block. So session 1, this is our AMRAP session for squat and bench. So here's 2 sets of 6 60%, 2 sets of 4 70%, and then a rep out at 80%. The goal being personal best. So the athlete achieved a 1 rep personal best on the squat, and a 2 rep personal best on the bench press, pushing this for 9 reps, pushing this for 12 reps. Again, you'll see it's the same session rep scheme. And then deficit deadlift, just a bit of technical work, also to keep fatigue high. Here we have deadlift, the exact same session rep scheme, repping out at 80%. Again, athlete or lifter achieved another 1 or 2 rep personal best. And then basically what we have, some more volume work, assistance work, and we have a little bit of overload work here for the bench press, utilizing the slingshot to get a good high volume load with a weight that the lifter won't be able to handle, obviously, without the slingshot. Here we go into week 2. So again, this is basically just high sets, low reps, concentrating on a reasonable percentage. So we're just working at 80% on this workout. So that'll be the same for the core lifts. So this was our overload, or our acute overload, or our acute overreach workout from week 1. This is our holding week, or our higher percentage, high rep, high set, low rep work. What we do here is we just produce a little bit of overload to these sessions. So rather than acutely increasing the weight, we just add like a bit of accommodating resistance, such as chains in the case of deficit deadlift. Deadlift, again, we're just using that 6 sets 3 8%. This all pretty much remains the same. And again, slingshot bench press, we've upped the intensity, dropped the volume by half, and we're working at, again, what we discussed before, just high reps, low sets. Trying to maybe, what we try to do with this kind of, the structure, or what I'm trying to do with the way this is laid out, is on here we're accumulating a high amount of fatigue. Not only are we doing a rep out set, but we're also doing not a high volume session, but still a moderate volume session, followed up by an all-out set, or what should be taken to failure, or as close to failure as the athlete can do. What this can do is, although it induces high levels of fatigue and definitely produces super compensation at the RN, what it can do though is it can teach the athlete incorrect, a poor movement pattern, poor technique. Some athletes will start utilizing their lower back more in a squat, in a bench press they might come offline, start utilizing their shoulders or triceps a bit more. They might start lifting their arse up off the bench. In deadlift, they might start riding their back more, or round their back excessively in a manner that we probably normally wouldn't live with in a non-rep out scenario. So what this does, this gives them a little a week to kind of maintain integrity with their lifting, to remind themselves of what a good technique is, but still training at a reasonable volume and a reasonable percentage, although it should be an easier week than the last overload week. And here we go into the next kind of overload week. So it's pretty much the same workout, except increased 5%. So this athlete will be repping out the squat at 180, repping out the bench press at 110, and repping out at the deadlift at 190. Normally round up or down, so 192 on that, probably 180 on that, and 110 on that. The same sort of training session. We've increased the assistance work up by 5%. Here you'll see we're working at 95% for 6 sets of 6 again. On the slingshot, same sort of idea with pause squat against bands. So we're up 5% from the last overload block. So again, this is a high fatiguing week. This is going to kind of kick the arse out of the athlete when they go through it. And then finally, we have another kind of holding block, although this is probably going to induce more overload. Doing 6 sets of 2 at 90% on key lifts, 80% on the assistance work. You know, this is going to be a tough week for the athlete. Here you'll see what we've done. Whereas we went overload on this week, we've actually went overload or high intensity. And then we've provided here the deadlift is a lighter deadlift session because we're doing our more of an overload or our intensity overload workout here third rather than second. This is just to give the lifter a chance to recover from this session, because through the previous 3 weeks they will have accumulated a lot of work, a lot of fatigue. Their back's going to start feeling sore. This is a scenario where we might come into a realistic discussion where we might actually axe these 2 exercises. What I'm really interested in is the first 3 weeks and then getting through this 6x2 workout on squat, bench and deadlift. So I'm more than willing to sacrifice some volume at this stage if it means I can take the lifter through that overload block to what I want. So that's a 4-week overload block that is currently being done by one of my lifters. What he'll do after this block, he'll go back into a preparation phase or a preparation block where he will probably have 2 or 3 weeks of easier training and then kind of ramp back up to more of that sort of training that we showed you here, this kind of prep block where we just flip-flop in a more normal fashion. Okay, so that's the case study. So here we have some examples of pyramids utilized by Boris Chico. Boris Chico put this up in his recent lecture or his seminar that I went to in February. So here you have 5 options of pyramids. Each one pretty much as tough as the other, some with slightly different different focuses. Like this is probably more of a volume focus. This is a bit more of an intensity focus. Each one of these is going to be a very difficult workout. This is something Boris suggested you only do in a preparation block. So in preparation blocks, basically you're more than 6 weeks away from your next competition, and it's something that he suggested you only really utilize once a week for each lift, and something that he said you probably want to change the pyramid that you utilize week to week for each lift. So if you go for 4 squat pyramids in a block, you could choose for 4 different options. So maybe take like a volume option week 1, take an intensity option week 2, volume week 3, intensity week 4. You could just screenshot these. This will be on all of this will be on the lecture notes, which I'll provide a PDF of on the online strength coach website that you can access. Okay, so final thoughts and considerations on overload block as my voice starts to give out. Overload block should definitely not be ran concurrently. Like we discussed before with Smolov, this is a great way of getting hurt. basically what we're doing, the goal of the overload block is we're intentionally not allowing the body enough time to recover or recuperate properly from the training. We're intentionally overstressing the body, so we can only do this for a finite period. Typically, I would say 3 to 4 weeks would be the max. Some lifters can handle it a bit better, some lifters can't handle it at all. There are some lifters I train where I would never put them into an overload block because it'd probably break if I did it. They should always be preceded and followed by proper preparation. So proper preparation is a high volume block, so like a technique block that we discussed beforehand, or a general prep block or something like that. A high period of work, but specific work. So if we're going to be overloading squat, then we need to do preparation squat block where our frequency is matched, maybe if not the workload's matched. So for example, if you plan on doing Russian squat routine, you should probably, if you squat once a week, you should maybe do 2 weeks of squatting twice a week and then 2 weeks of squatting 3 times a week and then go into the block rather than just going into the block cold, because if you do, you're probably going to get hurt. And then we need proper recuperation. So like we discussed with the case study, that lifter is going to go through a 2 to 3 week phase of lighter training, easier training, and then we'll start picking them up again, because we are inferring that they're going to be smashed after that 4 week block. And then we can infer from that Mike Stone block or the Mike Stone study that about 3 weeks is probably about sufficient for that. Although they might need slightly more because of the longer nature of the block. However, we'll pick them up as they go. Or we'll talk to them so we understand where they're at. This method of training is not for the novice athlete. So if you're new to lifting, you've been lifting for 1 year or 2 years, this information, although useful for you probably at some stage, this is not really applicable to you. If you've been lifting for 2 years and your technique's poor, you should not be doing Smolov. And for poorly conditioned intermediate athlete. So the example that I utilized beforehand of someone who wanted to try a Russian squat routine, however only trained once a week, that's an example of a poorly conditioned intermediate athlete. They're not conditioned to that frequency of training, so there is no way in hell they should be doing an Overreach program that has that higher frequency of training. Lifters with improper technique should never even consider this kind of training. So if your bench technique's off, your deadlift technique's off, or your squat technique's off, this kind of training is only going to do one thing, and that's injure you. If your technique's sound, then you can definitely utilize these kind of training methods, because they are quite powerful and they do utilize good gains in strength. But they need to be handled with the respect they're deserved. And if your technique's improper, then that's what you should be working on, not trying to get stronger. You should be trying to get better technique. This training should be completed in large preparation blocks where there are no competitions in the near horizon. Very straightforward. If you have a competition in 9 weeks, then doing a 4 week overload block, not a good idea. We should be looking at this like 16, 14 weeks out, maybe running one overload and then kind of coming away from it and then going into a more traditional kind of prep block. So we shouldn't be looking to do these in the lead up to comps, because we'll overcook ourselves and you'll be too difficult to peak when you're overcooked. You need to overcook yourself and then come back to a good level of performance, or provide sufficient recuperation time where you can enter a better or a specific competition block, which we will cover in the next lecture. And finally, for more content and information, check out the onlinestrengthcoach.com website. Of course, it's dot, not comma. For any questions or queries, please shoot me an email, speedpowerperformance@gmail.com. Again, dot, not comma. That's for any coaching queries, anything you'd like to hear me talk about, anything you'd like to podcast on, or any feedback you have for me, please shoot it off to that email. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. It really helps grow the channel. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Mark. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll check you on the next lecture for onlinestrengthcoach.com. Thank you very much for watching. The next lecture is going to be on comp-specific blocks for powerlifting. Okay, thanks for watching. And that does it.